Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? For at least 25 years I studied the book of Daniel, and in all that time I never bothered to ask the first question, which should have been, Who are these saints that are talking, and where did they come from? The Bible says, And it came to pass on the day that Moses had fully set up the tabernacle, and had anointed it, and sanctified it, and all the instruments thereof, both the altar and all the vessels thereof, that the priests of Israel brought their offerings before the Lord. And when Moses was gone into the tabernacle of the congregation to speak with him, then he heard the voice of one speaking to him from off the mercy seat that was upon the ark of the testimony, from between the two cherubims. And he spake unto him, God is faithful, in that he always says in the beginning what will happen in the end. And that is precisely what we're seeing here in number 7. When Moses had finished building and dedicating the tabernacle, which included everything that was associated with it, the entire leadership of Israel brought their offerings before the Lord. As Moses then went into the tabernacle, he heard the voice of someone talking. That someone was the Lord, who said to him, When you light the lamps, the 7 lamps shall give light over against the candlestick. Having said that, the following is what makes sense from this text in its proper context. The construction of the tabernacle was God giving to Israel his plan of salvation. When the task of building it was finished, it was dedicated to the Lord by all of the leaders of Israel. As that was happening, Moses went into the most holy place, which was where God resided over the mercy seat. Moses heard the voice of the Lord as he approached the mercy seat, and the Lord spoke to him from above the mercy seat, saying, When Aaron shall light the lamps on the 7 branches of the candlestick, that light will then become the source of light for that apartment. Consequently, it will illuminate whatever is over against it. In this image, the direction of the light is the issue, because that light makes it possible to see the table of showbread, which was over against or across from the lampstand. Apparently, God's point concerned the light shining on and thus illuminating the table of showbread. Lighting the candlestick made it possible to see what was on the other side of the apartment. The light of the candlestick illuminated the entire space, which included the table of showbread, because the only source of light in the holy place was the lampstand. Without that light, you couldn't see the table. And remember, the incense altar was also in that apartment. But then again, that was God's point, because God doesn't mention the incense altar or its horns at all. He says the issue is the table. God's point was the lesson of hindsight concerning the table of showbread. His object lesson involved both lighting the candlestick and then considering what that source of light would illuminate. Simply stated, God was saying to Moses, you need the light of the lamp in order to see the table, but you won't see either one until the light is turned on. That is the key. God's point was quite profound because Israel never did understand what the table of showbread meant. And that was a tragedy because the table was the whole point of it all. As a prophecy, it was an explanation of the Passover. The point was, Israel would never sit at the table in terms of his covenant relationship being fulfilled. The cross would be Israel's rejection of the promise, which would eventually be celebrated as a commemoration that we call Holy Communion. The realization of Christ's rejection, which was symbolized by the act of lighting the candlestick, would allow the priesthood of God's true church to see what was the communion of the Last Supper. The point was twofold. It was, one, the light shining in a dark place, which would be, two, the dedication of the priesthood to the event that the table represented, which will be the Last Supper. Both would be critically important, and both would happen in hindsight, not in real time. We know that Israel never received an understanding of the Passover, which is precisely God's point in Daniel 1. The Hebrew captives understood what the issue was, which is why they chose not to eat at the king's table. They knew that the Passover would be their only choice because of who they represented, which wasn't the nation of Israel. Remember, Christ passing between the divided sacrifices by himself represented that truth in the beginning when he made his covenant with Abram in Genesis 15. Abram was sound asleep, which represented Israel's spiritual condition and his failure to appreciate the offering of the entire sacrificial system. Israel offered Christ to Rome as a criminal, not as his blessed Redeemer. That was the point and the lesson that would have to be learned. This is the secret and the beauty of the holy place. The table has to come first because the commitment to the covenant is made before the act of sacrifice is offered in order to consummate that agreement, not afterwards. That is precisely what God was explaining in the layout of the furniture. Consequently, when it was time for Israel to dedicate itself to the plan, God told Moses what the leaders of Israel would do. He said, they've got it backwards. They wouldn't see the table because there would be no light in the holy place until after the event of the cross. Furthermore, they would be blind to the reality of the incense altar altogether. The table would only be seen after it would be too late. The one saint speaking is the angel of the Lord. He speaks from off the mercy seat, which is precisely God's point concerning the 2300 days. The reference to Christ as a saint would throw anyone off the trail because one wouldn't normally think of the Lord as a saint. But then that's the point. God became one of us. He became flesh and dwelt among us. He became flesh and dwelt among us, walking by faith as we must do. It's important to understand that in this passage, God is saying, Jesus is one of us. In all things, He is our example. The other saint is Moses. He's the one that asks the Lord, "How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice?" Moses asked the question in the context of the issue that he was confronted with. His first question was, how long will the darkness of ignorance last before the people see the light and understand that the table of showbread in the holy place is the Passover? That was his question, because that was the issue. And then he specifically asks, how long will the transgression of desolation be, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? Be sure to note here that Moses' question concerns the duration of the offense, not the issue concerning what it was. He stated quite plainly what the nature of the transgression would be. He calls it the transgression of desolation that would trample underfoot both the plan and the people of God. And the answer he's given is, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed.